Okay, let's just see. I've got a message or two. Okay. It's sort of 1 minute past. I think if everybody's okay, I'm gonna start. I know it's a weird time of year, but this is our last ADDN meeting for 2023. It's been a really beautiful year, and thank you for all of you who are sitting in the room for really journeying with us. And we're looking forward to the adventures that 2024 is going to bring. So because Sydney also has other commitments, we thought today we've got 3 or 4 items on the agenda, but one of the things that has become so incredibly beautiful is asking artists, scholars, practitioners to share their praxis and their thoughts and ideas to kind of grow our sensibility and open up ideas for discussion. And so I'd like to really thank Sydney for, in a very busy time, giving us this hour or 45 minutes to just really talk a little bit about your work. I think most of you know Sydney quite well. She's a doctoral candidate in disability studies at the University of Illinois in Chicago. She studied dance and disability and is working on a multi-sited ethnography on inclusive dance companies in South Africa and Finland, and particularly with a focus on dancers with intellectual disabilities. I know Sydney not only as an academic, but also she spent some time with us last year in South Africa, and she's become a great friend and a huge inspiration. I know when I have questions around things like access, Sydney is always the first person that I go and speak to, because I think she's a huge body of knowledge. And I'm just so grateful, Sydney, for you and for you to share this with us. So I'm going to hand over to Sydney to talk us through her beautiful presentation. And I'm hoping that as she's speaking, there'll be some ideas and thoughts that we can raise and talk about as we go along. So handing over to you, Sydney.
Lovely. Thank you, Leanne. And it's a nice small group. So Jessie and Megan, if you have any questions as we go, just interrupt and I'm happy to stop and we can chat. And does anyone need audio descriptions today, or are we good? No? Okay, cool. Let me share. As soon as it's time to present the slideshow, I always forget where the button is. I don't know why that always happens. So, as Leanne said, my name is Sydney Erlikh, and my artistic interest and research is on neurodivergent dancers, representations of dancers with intellectual disabilities, or ID, as I'll be saying frequently in here. For those of you in the UK, that would be learning disabilities, not intellectual disabilities. And then also on inclusive and disability dance education. And also, as you'll notice today in my practice, so my teaching and my artistic practice, I often use a lot of augmentative and alternative communication. And there's just a few photos of me dancing on the screen with our collective that we have in Chicago. So this collective that we have in Chicago is called Unfolding Disability Futures, and it's a collective of disabled, sick, injured, and neurodivergent dancers, and it's founded with the goal of providing a platform for Chicago's disabled performing artists to explore, collaborate, and produce work. UDF was launched actually in 2022 as a series of workshops and installations and performances at the Plant, which is a former meatpacking facility in Chicago's back of the yards neighborhoods in Chicago. And we got a neighborhood access grant, it was called, and we collaborated with the Plant. The reason why we used the Plant is we wanted to consider site-specific performance and we wanted to consider a performance venue that was still accessible, but also performance opportunities that would be safe for us during COVID. So how could we create smaller performances that would keep both the audience safe, but also make the performers feel more safe? And so we use this meat, which used to be a meat packing facility, which is now kind of like a startup location. And we had different performances in different locations, and then small audiences were taken through the plant on basically a tour. And so you saw different visual artists we went through, but there was also performances by performance artists. This piece here is my piece, which was called Monetary Sway, and it was made with 5 dancers. I'm actually performing for a dancer that got sick. Unfortunately, that's what happens when you perform in a pandemic, but we did perform over multiple weekends, so she was still able to perform. And I think it's nice to think of the ways that you can create access by considering the ways that you can use improvisation, scores, as you'll notice here, graphics, and also thinking about using works that switch in and out different body minds. And so, as I said, I've been frequently using AAC in dance. And so this is one of the first scores that I made for a work that we were creating at Access Living. And so this is pre-COVID, but we wanted to make sure that we had an improvisational score that was available to the dancers to use and access during the performance. And so it was up on a wall in the room that we were performing in. And as you can see, it's in text, but also picture symbols that we had decided on collectively as a group and rehearsed with. And keeping it up, the dancers were concerned with it, but I argue that it's actually beneficial to keep it up because you're showing the ways that access is being created not only for the performance and the performers, but also then we considered that as well as access for the audience members, as also kind of thinking about the ways that you can create access both ways. There we go. So then from there, I've really thought about I create boards. I often use them when I teach. I use a lot of symbols, especially when I teach children. So oftentimes I hold up the symbol that we're doing. I often use the brain dance, which is an Anne Green Gilbert it's an Anne Green Gilbert warm-up, and I have picture symbols that I made for that. And when I teach kids, I always make sure that I have a symbol that goes with that. So you're giving multiple ways to access the material, both verbally, visually, and then physically. But then I also used choreography boards, and I have multiple AAC boards that I've experimented and used with, and I use them as a tool. So for example, if I were to send off dancers, I might give dancers a choice of taking a board with them when they're going off to create a short movement phrase, maybe even if they want to use it as an assistive tool when they're improvising with a partner. And I also have a feedback board and an ending board that I use as well. These are not perfect. I always change them. Many people question why I use Mayor Johnson, which are the picture symbols that you can see here, which is a codified tool. I'm going to be honest, I use Mayor Johnson because mostly I'm focusing on working with adults, and Mayor Johnson was the codified form of picture symbols at that time. So most people who are going to be in their 20s and 30s are going to be familiar with Mayor Johnson because they would have seen it when they were in school. So for example, when I was working with Flatfoot, when I was in South Africa, all of the dancers recognized it from school. So they were familiar with all the symbols. And I think it's important, the familiarity, because these are abstract concepts, especially when we're discussing dance. And so that's why they're familiar with them. I know many people that use there's many that have come out. Symbol sticks is one. And I think that oftentimes when I'm teaching kids, they're less attached because they oftentimes are given multiple different symbols versus just this one codified language symbol system. So I'll switch in a lot more than I would when I'm just using them in practice with adults. So here's another way that I think of using picture symbols. So again, this is the improvisational score. So at the beginning of the piece, the dancers had a specific amount of time that they were just improvising in this space. And so I made this board, and each dancer had the pictures in their space. So they could pick where they wanted it, but then again, they were visible for the audience. But I think it's both a tool and also a beautiful artistic work, right? Because these are still images that are representing the codified moves, but it's also a memory as well. So kind of like an exchange between the two. And it's useful, again, not just for dancers with intellectual disabilities. One of the dancers came back and obviously hadn't been rehearsing with us for some time. And so she had a nice visual for her that was taped on the floor in front of her that she could use, and assisted her with making choices. Then this is from my work in South Africa. So I was really lucky when I was there. Not only was I interviewing one dancer specifically for my dissertation, but Leanne very nicely asked me to make a work with the company, and also asked me to work one-to-one individually with each of the dancers that are, has Down syndrome that's in their company. And so I asked each of the boys that were in the company very specific questions, and they all helped basically create their own board that they used to choreograph from. So I gave them a lot of picture symbols. Obviously, you can see here that there's also photos. So I went in and discussed with them like things that was useful to them. So improvisation is a very specific dance term. I don't know if that's the best photo, but that's what this dancer decided with me. They also have a name of another dancer in the company, and that was really important to them because they wanted to dance like that person, and they wanted that on their choreography board. And they also, as you can see, have like ballroom dancing and judo, so other styles of dance that they wanted. And then with each of the dancers, I would work with them, and they made a short movement phrase. We decided that these movement phrases would then be embedded within the piece that I made for the company. So it wasn't just my piece. They also had each of the boys had or men had their solos embedded within the company. And in fact, actually, one of the dancers that's on the screen there also used his choreographic board to choreograph on me. So he used it to create a short phrase for himself, but then he also used it to create a short phrase of choreography on me that he then embedded into the piece, and all of the dancers did it. And so I think it's a really lovely tool that then can be used. It's not the only tool, right? It's dance, other things get used, but it is nice in that way. I do have both of the other boards that the other two men created, so that you can see how different they are based on the choices that they made and things that were important to them. This dancer really thought about binaries on the right-hand side. As you can see, they were really focusing on heavy and light, high and low, and they really were thinking that they wanted those specific things, whereas the dancer on the left really wanted a lot more like Michael Jackson, Dirty Dancing, Elvis, and they really were thinking kind of about the quality of the movement, but also a variety of movement styles that they wanted to think about using in their choreography. Did you have any questions about these boards, or is there some more specificity that I could add? Yeah, Leanne.
I'd like to ask, so just in terms of translating these visual images into movement, how did that work in the studio?
So it depended on the dancer. Each of them works differently. I find that oftentimes, even if I were to give you a word now and I were to say straight, that's, you're each going to interpret it very differently. For example, the dancer that wanted to choreograph on me, he specifically would point at something and I would do a variety of things. So like body shakes. So I would kind of do, let's say he asked me to shake, I would shake in different ways, just a limb, just a thing. And sometimes he would, add a picture to it to kind of get me to do what he wanted. And then frequently he would say stop when I did something that I wanted. And then I would repeat it. And then he would say, yes, that's what I want. And then we would move on in that way. Some of the other dancers were very specific. So one of the dancers was very specific. He would pick something, he would do it. That's the move that he was doing for it. Move on. Did not want to experiment at all. I think it's also to think about how a lot of people kind of have different traits as like choreographer, performer, dancer. And I think the ways that they approached using the boards maybe kind of match those things more. And now that I'm reflecting on them, I would say that each of them kind of represents like maybe each one of those, that like those are kind of each of their strengths. Like one of them is, I think would be a really great teacher. One of them is a really great choreographer. And then also one, it has so many strengths as a performer. But in those ways, then they each kind of approached choreography differently. And one of them specifically did want a movement score. So I then made, similar to how you saw before, the picture symbols that described his entire movement all the way down. So we went back and I put them in order. And sometimes I would put a number with it because he would do this 3 times, so on and so forth. And then that became the score that he used all the way down, and to practice at home. Does that answer it?
Yeah, thanks, Sydney. Yes, very much so.
Yeah. And I do want to say, though, that in my research, I'm also here in Finland currently and working with a dancer. And what I find to be really interesting is that all of the dancers there were very excited to work with picture symbols. I've also had many dancers with and without disabilities in the US that are very excited to work with picture symbols with and without words. And here in Finland, the dancers specifically stated that they did not want to use picture symbols at all. And they stated numerous times that that's not something that they wanted to do. And so then I was a little confused if maybe this is something that was unfamiliar, but I had my board sitting on a bench with me when I was at it, like a disability group kind of event. Someone said, "Oh, Mayor Johnson symbols." So then I knew right away that it's actually just a choice that this dancer has made. And that's interesting in itself. So I had a little piece that I thought we could see. So my choreography is in the back, but I will stop sharing. The first dancer's board that we saw, his choreography will be in the front.
Is that visible to everyone?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I'm going to play.
You can pause, Leanne. unless we want to keep watching. Next actually is another dancer's choreography, but it's a nice little taste. The interesting thing about the work as well is that each of the dancers had very specific music, and I hadn't thought that when we were working together that we would be putting this into a piece together, and I really wanted them to choose their own individual solos. And so they all had very specific music, and I then had to kind of decide how to hold these very different music choices together into one piece. So the next piece I briefly want to talk about is Right to Wander. This is a piece that I was asked to do this summer, and this is me and a dancer, Mapril, in Chicago dancing at the Art Institute. And so we were asked to take part in something which was called Cripping the Gallery. I had sent the 2 reviews about it to you. I think that these are lovely as well, because oftentimes in media in Chicago, we've really been fighting against representations that disability is inspirational and also like paternalism in relation to intellectual disability. And so I think that both of them very nicely do not represent disability in that way. And so this piece was co-created with Mapril, so I curated the whole show with another of my colleagues here in Chicago, but then we choreographed pieces ourselves, and Mapril and I choreographed this together. And we kind of went about it by going on multiple visits to the museum, and then we started by just discussing things the art reminded us of, and then movements we felt represented these, and then we would kind of create different movement for each section. And we had decided that we'd go out and around the room, and that kind of made the basis of the choreography, that we knew that each wall would come to represent kind of like a different theme that we felt that it represented. And then music and audio descriptions, Mapril really wanted to make sure that it was kind of based on the sounds that were in the piece and kind of that was in the art, so that it was adding an additional textural kind of component. And I thought that that was a really lovely idea, because it's just another layer when we're talking about audio description, especially for anyone who has a visual impairment who is attending. And then the audio descriptions were a collaboration between Mapril and I very specifically wanted her to work with me on those audio descriptions. I'd come off of a very bad kind of experience at the end of my time. I had been in South Africa, where suddenly they were like, oh, we need an entire description of this other dancer's piece, and they needed it like a day and a half before. They told me a day and a half before, and she was performing, and then I had to write it, and it didn't make me feel amazing. And then it had to be interpreted, and then she of course approved of it, and I was able to pull so much of it from the dramaturgy notes of the piece, but it just still didn't feel very good to be. It felt like I was being asked to kind of speak for someone with an intellectual disability, and that didn't feel like something I wanted to do. So I really wanted to make sure that Mapril's voice was both recorded in the audio description, but also that her words were in the audio description, and it ended up being kind of a combination of what she said, things that we'd already said while we were devising the piece, and then also I pulled specific descriptions from the art, because I thought they were so important both to us while we were creating the work, but also anyone who had sight who was in the space would be seeing the art. And I wanted that to be a tool for others that were unable to see the art. And so I have a short, brief description. If you want to go to all of the audio descriptions, they're still up from the piece. I'm trying to move this so that you can, and you can scan that QR code, and it should take you right to the full audio descriptions for our text. But it says, Sydney uses her arms to raise the wall of the house, bending her hands into a roof. Mapril steps on to Sydney for an adventure. Holding on to one another, they push away to find their nature. Creating rocky peaks with their arm, they are free to ramble. Meeting up, they join hands, moving back to a new path. So the first half is really Mapril, that first section. I added to find their nature at the end of that sentence, because that was kind of the theme of the wall. But Maple oftentimes really wanted very specific either phrases. I know if you're familiar with dance, you often kind of end up having these words that stand in for a section or a movement that you're doing. And then she kind of wanted a very specific description of what was kind of happening. And I know in the article, or in the interview for the article, she had talked about how they were kind of wayfinding for her. So they were modes of access for her to remember what was coming up in the next section. Whereas I saw audio description as a great way to describe how we were creating movement that matched the movements in the visual art. And that's kind of all that I had for you. This is just one final photo from a piece that I think is lovely. And the space was just really nice to be in this gorgeous museum with all this art. So.
Wow, thank you so much, Sydney, for giving us a little bit of insight into your process. So I'm going to, I'm sure there are questions from Jess and Megan, but I've got I'm going to pick up on the audio descriptor. I mean, I know I have just recently, obviously with our own Access Festival that's just happened, we've been having a lot of discussions around audio descriptions and around particularly sensitivities around race, gender, queer, the naming, you know, and how much do you name and how much don't you name, and what becomes, you know, because the audio description it's a poetry, particularly if it's responding as you've done so beautifully to the movement. But say in a context like South Africa, you know, just having this conversation around the optics of, do we speak race? Do we speak disability? Do we speak, you know what I mean? So I'm just interested to push a little bit, because it's a journey that I'm beginning to discover. And I know Vet and I had a lot of discussion about it when we were setting up the website for ADDN. Like, do we just explain, or do we explain and embellish? Do we poeticize? But what is necessary for the audio descriptive, and how much is the person doing the audio description inserting? I mean, I'm fascinated. It's a big thing for me. Yeah.
I don't think I have all of the answers for it yet. I wish that I did. I think so far in my creative practice, I generally choose to let people describe themselves. And so that means that Maple didn't describe herself as a woman with a disability and didn't say that she had Down syndrome. But I think that that is up to her, that she is a woman and that she can decide how she wants to describe herself. And that's generally how I approach it. For example, also sometimes people don't have pronouns, like in Finland, there are no pronouns. So that's interesting, because then when we were creating her audio descriptions and I was trying to create the English versions of her audio descriptions, she never wanted to be called a she, because she was like, well, we don't have pronouns, like what's the point of it? And so then I would just always use her name as a way of replacing that. Other times, you know, I do use they, them, and I do think it's important that people do, you know, be more specific, I think, about their identity choices, but I also think that it's up to them. And I think that by artists doing their own audio descriptions, then they can decide what is important for them and how they want to be described. And I think that sometimes in descriptions we can focus so much on all of the descriptions that it then becomes not part of the art. And we have a colleague in Chicago. I'll finish and then then Jesse, you can add. We have a colleague, and he says, I don't want to listen to one more person saying that I'm looking at Leanne. I'm looking at a woman with reddish hair, has a green strap, blue, I you can just be very simple and move on. I'm so far behind by listening to all of those descriptions that I would much prefer a more artistic, descriptive process.
Jess.
I was just going to say that in a project that I'm working on at the moment with the development scheme that I'm on, they've been really careful about, like, when they've needed a bio for marketing, for instance, they also ask for a description. So if there's a photo alongside the bio, then they just ask us to send a description as well. So then that is that very individualized approach that you were talking about, Sydney, and that's been really, really helpful because it allows for space for things like pronouns if that's important to the individual person, but it also gives space to not necessarily mention that you're a wheelchair user in my case if that's not useful. Like, for instance, for my headshot, you can't tell that I'm a wheelchair user, so what is the relevance of the fact that I'm a wheelchair user in the context of that photo? So that's been really freeing to have that personal connection. Obviously, not everybody will have that capacity, so I think standards in some cases are important then. But also, I was really struck, Leanne, by what you said about the poeticization of it, and there's a wonderful project that I think is New York based, but I might be wrong, that's called Alt Text as Poetry. And so it's about thinking about alt text as an art form in its own right as well. And that's been really interesting to kind of follow along. Interestingly, both of the people who are involved in kind of leading on that project are non-binary, so they might have interesting perspectives in terms of gender. And also I think race, because they're not both white, although I don't know how specifically they would define. But yeah, in case that's useful.
Very much so. I mean, I love the idea of obviously asking the person responsible to define and speak for themselves. I'm also aware that sometimes we're in situations where you are suddenly sent photographs that you are then required to audio descript, and you kind of go, it's that sort of concern around.
It's a stress.
Yeah, there is a stress, and yeah. But thank you. I found that extremely helpful. I think I do err on the side of the poetic, because dance is a poetry, and it's not something one can, you can't say, 3 shakes to the left and then a fall on the floor, because that in anybody's head could be a whole body shake and a big fall, or it could be a finger shake and an elbow to the, there's so many variations on a theme. So it's also that idea of can we audio descript that allows for the poetry of the dance still to sit,
Yeah. And this is like something that's interesting, because we really got into arguments, kind of at the university. And I often find that non-dancers and non-visually impaired people have pushed back on dancers describing things, because to me, it's like really important for the movement. If they're specifically doing like a very codified ballet technique, then like, even if someone doesn't know what a pirouette is or a dégagé, like, it's still, you can add those terms in and they have a weight and a meaning to them. And so we were arguing that, and theater people were like, well, we don't want you to tell us that. But then who else? Like, so that's why I kind of think it's nice to embed it in the work itself. And I do think, I mean, it was nice. My artist here just reperformed her work, and there was a visually impaired MC at the event, and he was crying after her performance, because hers was the only one with live audio description, like, that was embedded into the artistic work. And after, he said, like, damn, disability can be really cool.
Yeah.
And so
Wow.
it's like also really beautiful to think about the ways that like by embedding audio description, like it expands the work. And that doesn't mean oftentimes I think that you have to talk the whole time. Most of my works,
Yeah, because I
they
think I
don't
love
talk
that.
constantly.
I mean, I love the idea of expand, the idea that the audio description becomes embedded, as you're saying, to expand the art of the works. It's not an explaining. It's not like, you know, 3-4 women, you know, on a screen, you know, but that it's so that's a provocation that I really like. Thank you for that. So, yeah.
Yeah.
Jess.
And my
Just really quickly, this isn't directly dance, but one of my friends is a drag king and does burlesque and is also visually impaired. And so audio describes that. And it is fascinating to observe because it's not only sort of the direct engagement with the audio description, but just how that can transform even the sighted members of the audience's relationship with what is happening on stage, because it somehow makes it simultaneously more distant, so it's safer, but then it's also more intimate because you're having to really confront exactly what is happening at each stage. So that's been a fascinating thing to kind of
Yeah,
engage with.
yeah. I mean, I'm just grateful. Megan.
Hi. Yeah, I was just thinking about earlier you said you also use like improvisational scores and improvisation as part of your work. And thinking of that in terms of audio description, how do you navigate that if you know there are sections of improvisation in a piece or yeah. Okay.
This is a great question. So this is also when the silence happens, or not fully silence. And I think that Kayla Hamilton has done some really cool work in New York. They're a visually impaired dancer, and they do a lot of really cool work as well on the ways that sound, and they incorporate sound into their performance. But a lot of times, this is when the more poetic audio descriptions come into place, because, for example, the piece with Maple, there were some things that happened and some things that were just they were not I'm sorry, they were improvised. So we kind of knew what we were going to do, but it was still improvised. And so these are the moments where no one in improvisational score is just improvising. You know, it's always there's a set skill that you're doing, there is a set score that you're following, and then how can you use poetry and text to describe that score? Maybe that is also a moment where you use the time to describe a dancer, or you use that moment to describe a little bit more about the costume, or you use that moment to describe perhaps some themes or some of the conversation that happened while you were creating the piece as well. So using those things as a tool. So the dancer here, I suggested that she create audio descriptions in her piece, which was like kind of it's like 5 sections that are roughly improvised. And I had suggested that she create audio descriptions, and I would help her do it, because then she'd have a set piece that she could take anywhere that would be accessible. And I just thought it was best practice for me as her dramaturg to be doing that for her. And so then we took basically all of the text that she had used to describe the creative process, the movements, what she had said about the feelings in that section, and those then became like placeholders for each of those sections. And so no, we weren't specifically saying that she jumped on the ground, but when she does jump in the air and yell Yahoo, like someone can still hear that. It's very verbal. And throughout the piece, she often did use a lot of sound. So there was a rhythmic section where she was banging on the ground and hitting her body and things like that. And all of those add an additional, I'd say, kind of texture to the piece as well.
Thank you. Yeah, it's just interesting. I have a background in improv theatre, which is obviously quite different. But I've been thinking about ways of thinking of interpretation as well with sign language and the art of improvising sign language. It'd be interesting because obviously you're talking about it sounds amazing. These pre-prepared audio descriptions that bring in all these creative elements from across the whole process, which sounds gorgeous and obviously had a real impact on that audience member. But then I'm thinking of that, what would that be like, of having that slightly distinct art of that, of improvised audio description. Maybe somebody's already out there doing it. I don't know. That would be a different thing.
Yeah, so I do that in my teaching practice. So like when I teach, for example, if Leanne was teaching, or dancing, I would perhaps say, Leanne reaches her arms out and curves forward, a nice big stretch and breath towards the sky, and I will offer audio description. I never want an audio describer in a workshop that I teach, because I just find it to be an access barrier for me, because then the person's not listening and participating in the class in the same way. So I provide that audio description within my practice. Another artist that I work with in Chicago, Maggie Bridger, does a lot on audio description, and she really is way more experimental than I am. She's done a lovely piece where they had sound pieces on their costume, and that was part of the choreography, so that created additional textural sound. But also then they always perform their audio descriptions live. That would be an access barrier for my performers. Asking an artist with an intellectual disability to perform something live for my dancers that I've worked with, that would be an extra barrier for them, versus an access tool, which is what I would like it to be. And but either they've recorded live where they just describe it while they're doing there, or oftentimes they have them written and they read them as well. So just like a script, and they take turns describing. And then another artist in this same work, they just they did them live and improvised, and that meant that sometimes there was an audio description and sometimes there wasn't, is what I would say.
Fascinating. I'm acknowledging Yvette has come into the room. So hi, Yvette. Lovely to have you with us. I'm sort of fascinated.
Very late.
No,
sorry.
It's all good. I'm sort of fascinated also, as a choreographer. I'm interested in the palimpsest, I'm interested in the layering of things. And so the idea of audio descriptions is not being something which is tacked on, but the idea of the embedding. So I really appreciate this conversation, and thank you so much for for the comments and for the questions and for the provocations around thinking. I'm going to offer I know Yvette wasn't here, and I know she'll catch up with the recording, but I don't know if Jess and Megan, if you've got any other questions that you want to ask Sydney while she's still with us. Jessie?
This is taking things back quite a bit. Sorry, I needed to kind of percolate before I could work out how to phrase it. But actually, one of the points you just made about not wanting things to be an additional access barrier if they are providing access in another way is really helpful in kind of formulating my question. When you were talking about using the symbols as that physicalized form of AAC, I kind of wondered, I know you've talked about how you use it practically in a rehearsal to create choreography, but I kind of wondered how that works when the person who is using the AAC doesn't have any spoken communication, and so is solely relying on the physicality, because obviously dance is such a physical thing. I was just interested in that, probably thinking about how, as a person with the brain injury, I find it difficult to do lots of different physical things at once. And obviously, a lot of the people who use AAC would be people with impairments like cerebral palsy, for instance. And again, there's lots of crossover with ID in that community too. So yeah, just that physicality and the practicality of that?
So I think the answer for me is like specificity and simplicity. So making it's maybe I use AA symbols in the same way that you would use the kind of the practice of one voice in the space, right? So if someone has a hearing impairment, you oftentimes are saying like, let's make sure that we're only having one voice. I think in general, I kind of, right, if this is the choice that you're making, that's the choice. And I try to reiterate that that's the choice, and we're all going to work on that choice. And then as the choreographer and teacher, I kind of try to feel the room and read when it feels like that's kind of fizzled out and we're doing something else. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, that's really useful. Thank you.
And thank you for it, because I hadn't thought about it really in that way. And I think that is kind of the way that I think of it. Like, and I do, especially when I teach kids, a lot of people disagree. And I don't know if you find this, Jess, or have experienced this, where someone makes a choice and people are like, that's not really what they meant. And they're like, no, they actually pointed to angry. So like, that's a valid choice, and we're going to respect that. Like, whatever choice people make is a valid choice, and that's what we're working with. And I try to reiterate that. And especially when I'm working with kids, I find that that's a frequent thing. And it is a barrier in the practice, is that they're hearing from someone else, not me, who maybe knows better, that that wasn't a good choice. But I find maybe
so that kind of intermediary in the communication, which can be an access need, but then can complicate the individual interaction with the creative process. That's really, really interesting. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And are you familiar with Lisa Simpson, Jess?
The name rings a bell. Yeah.
She also has a much more complicated board as well in the UK called the Simpson board, and it's based off of language of dance. And I believe she created it with Adam Benjamin, and she uses it to choreograph works, and it's a much more complicated board.
Sydney, may I also ask a question, having watched your process a little bit in Durban? So one of the things that I've, for me in trying to find ways to work with particularly dancers with Down syndrome is memory, is the idea of how does one provoke memory, and the idea of learning phrases and knowing them. So obviously I've created a system which is a partnering system, which is seeming like we're moving less and less away from that. But I'm wondering, for you, how, if you wanted to just, and it's not a quantifiable question, it's just an asking, do you think the boards assisted with memory? Do you think it assisted with the idea of because I know there's a lot of practice and repetition, for any dance, it's completely about repetition. Do you think the boards were a good provocation around provoking memory? Or is it more an impulse choreography?
So I don't use the boards as a memory tool after the fact. I would use a choreographic score in picture symbol as a memory tool. I oftentimes, just like for all of the dancers, I'll write up the whole piece step by step, also record it and include it in a Dropbox. And that's been very important during COVID because we are not around each other as much. And so that's like a way for them to practice individually at home. So both video, and then I have the whole thing typed up. Our dancers here with ID don't really want it in picture symbol form anymore. But I would argue that for improvisational scores, I still think that picture symbols are the best tool for disabled and non-disabled dancers, because it gets away from being like so specific. And actually, now that you're saying that, I'm working on a new piece, and we're really kind of struggling with these improvisational sections in the middle. And I am working with another choreographer who doesn't use picture symbols, and so we didn't for that section. And now that you said that, I think I'm going to maybe make some boards, and like new boards and picture symbol kind of improvisation guides that might kind of help expand the movements that we're getting from the dancers. I would argue, Leanne, though, I just want to provoke you. I actually don't think that your specific memory tool is always partnering. I think that it is that in some ways, but I would argue I think your biggest memory tool is the codified technique that you set at the very beginning of each practice. And I think that's really, really lovely. And I've already stolen that. I teach using that. I've made a whole workshop using that. I say that it's yours and I steal it, but I think that like this idea that together we're collectively creating a codified movement vocabulary that then is warming up our body minds, but also preparing us to perform that is like a really lovely access tool that I don't think I've seen anyone use. And I hadn't thought about doing it that way as well. So.
Okay. No, it is. I mean, it's the way of getting a collective memory around movement, and the repetition and the doing, the adding and the repetition. Thanks, Sydney. Thank you very much. Megan, I'm handing it to you. I don't know if you have any more questions for Sydney, or if you're feeling okay.
I think I'm okay for now, but it was very interesting.
Thanks, Megan. Thank you so much. Sydney, it's just been such a privilege and a pleasure to listen to you speak and to share your work. And, in a community of us trying to grow possibilities. I'm so grateful, and I know Yvette as well, that you took time to do this. I can see the time's marching on, and I know that you have other places to be. But I really thank you, and I know it's the end of the year and everyone's kind of like frazzled. So for you to have put this together for us, and also I really appreciated the reading as well. It will be there, and we'll keep it as a shared thing that we would offer. So just to say thank you very, very much for that. Really, really appreciate it. I'm going to, I know that's just come in now, but we had two really other small items on the agenda, and that was just a little bit of a report back on the Jomba Masihambisane archiving launch, which I'm going to ask Yvette to speak to. And then I will talk a little bit about the two festivals that have happened in South Africa, and if there's any other business, we can take that. So I'm going to hand over to Yvette.
Thank you. And I've got the wrong name and I have no idea how to change it. And it probably tells you a little bit of where I'm up to. So I'm not myself. I've come from teaching, and it's the last week of term. So everybody wants to ask something. So that's my apologies. So the Jomba Masihambisane, both the colloquium and the launch was super, super exciting around the this question around integrated dance and what we need to think about and how we can share and build communities that can actually have difficult conversations. I think what really came up for me at both events was how refreshing people felt to have a space to talk about things on whatever level. So the idea of the taboo, but also the level of both the naive and the super experienced, and the researcher meeting the artist, and people felt excited about the space. But coming back to it after 6 months, there was also a sense of reflection, that people had time to think and how they developed their thinking. And that's where I think the archive is particularly beautiful and important, because it allows us to go back. It also allows people that maybe weren't there or were there for part of it to access not just written work, but also the conversations and the kind of embodied engagements with these conversations. So it both felt to me like they were very energized, very excited. And for the launch, what particularly struck me was how Gerard started off saying that he couldn't speak because world events were too difficult and he had no hope. And then as we talked, we remembered why we were doing the work and how it does give us hope It gives us something to work with and for. And by the end of the hour, I think we all felt reinvigorated. And again, I thought these are not just academic spaces. These are spaces of communitas and renewal. So I think that the archive is extraordinary, and not just this one, 3 years of it. And in my opening, I tried to frame the significance of how we got to this moment, because it doesn't come out of nowhere. It actually comes out of 3 years, and it comes out of the AIN's vision, actually, for Jomba, 25 years, and for this dialogue over the last 3 years. So super important, but also, I think, renewing for everybody that was part of the community. And who knows what's going to happen next year. But that was important. And I think this space has also been important differently. I've just had quite a few emails from people saying, sorry, can't make it. Sorry, I think the time change has affected people, but also it's the last week and there's lots of challenges. But people proposing things for next year, sending apologies and sense of solidarity, and certainly to Sydney. So I think the space is also doing something around that. And these are spaces that are, I think, important reflective spaces against the festivals that are way ahead of where we are in terms of our critical reflections. And I think I'd like to see us catching up with the practice that's happening in our reflective critical practice. So those are my musings at the end of almost the end of a long year.
Thanks, Yvette. And please, the archives are free. So, please go onto the Jomba website and click onto the Jomba Masihambisane Archives, and it will take you straight there, and hopefully to be used as tools for teaching or for students or research, but also for other artists to look at. So I'm just going to quickly talk to you about, there are three festivals in South Africa. November is Disability Awareness Month. There's a push-pull around a month around that. I mean, you know how people feel about like 16 days of activism against gender violence. There should be a lifetime awareness. But what we've tried to set up in South Africa is to create a sort of network of festivals that are about access and inclusivity. And the 3 festivals are the Body Moves Festival, which happens in Johannesburg and Benoni, the Flatfoot Access Festival, which happens in Durban, and then the 3rd festival is the Artability Festival that happens in Cape Town, that is hosted by Unmute Dance Company. So it's a very, the Unmute Festival is the longest running festival. It's been going for a long time. The Benoni Festival, it's in its 2nd year, and the Flatfoot Access Festival, it's also in its 2nd year. So the idea that artists are shared amongst the 3 festivals, and that an artist would come to Johannesburg and go on to Cape Town or Durban. So it's sort of happened, but not as much as we hoped that it would. I have not been to the Access Festival, to the Artability Festival in Cape Town, although apparently it's gone really well. I took a piece with 3 dancers to the Benoni Festival, the Body Moves Festival, and I was really, I've sort of spoken to Yvette about it, but the festival was had a very different feel to last year. Last year's festival felt much more joyful and celebratory. This year, the festival seemed to be dealing a lot with grief, and a lot around sexuality, around disability and sexuality, which people found quite shocking, as you can imagine that they would. But so those 2 themes really emerged quite strongly, and I thought that was quite interesting in terms of the kind of seriousness with which artists with and without disabilities are engaging access and that kind of work. So that was really interesting, and I hope that we can reflect on that more. Really, Andile Bellum, who's a dancer, who's a deaf dancer, made a piece. His son was murdered earlier this year, and made an extraordinary work about that. Very no holds barred work, where he strips naked on stage and does a whole ritual, a mourning ritual, which was, of course, very shocking to an audience. And it's all done through his particular sign language dance that he's developing. Incredibly beautiful work, which I know opened the festival in Cape Town. So the Flatfoot Access Festival, it was a little bit bigger than last year. It's still a small festival. We had a guest from Switzerland, Jörg Koch, who is a really interesting, been working in access for a long time. did some workshops with a mixed group of people with disabled, non-disabled, intellectual disabilities, physical disabilities, etc. A really interesting group of 18 dancers who came together, and there was a lovely showing of the work. And, you know, some of the photographs have been shared, very eye-opening. We included communities. Access also became about communities that haven't been included in mainstream dance kind of spaces as well. So we were working with a community from South Durban. Yeah, and we had two evenings of performances with works by both dancers with intellectual and physical disabilities and integrated practices, and non-disabled dancer, also Jörg working. Also, interestingly, issues around masculinity starts to emerge quite strongly, particularly from the South Durban work. Quite vulnerable issues around quite vulnerable masculinity, but a resurgence of quite athletic dancers in wheelchairs or wheelchair users. So really interesting stuff. I was quite impressed that our audience, we were working in a small theatre which seats about 180 people. And apart from, you know, you always think, oh, the friends and family are going to come, because you can always have an audience, but you don't always have a critical audience. So, you know, and that's a discussion I hope that we can certainly, you know, pick up later. But the idea of people who, for me, you know, it's when people come afterwards and they say to you, which is a kind of response that I really, as an artist, really hate, when people go, you know, what you're doing is so wonderful, as if it's some kind of community therapy, you know, and I have to say it's a very painful response, and you have to smile and take it because it's the mother of a child or of a dancer. But you know, so situating that in against the kind of idea of saying, well, we're not social workers, we're artists, and we're interested in these kinds of constructions around the body. So there's a lot to unpack and talk about, which I hope could form provocations. And I think they're things that we all think about as artists. I was also struck earlier the year with Petra Capers saying that she prefers to stay in a community art space. And I've been thinking a lot about why, and that's something I'm going to kind of think about over the holidays, and then thinking about what happens when the work does go into an art space. Are we fearful? Are we fearful of moving out of a community art space, or is the community art space where the work is best situated in terms of audience? So these are many provocations that are swirling around in my head, and I hope that, you know, with your help, we can start to have the engagement and the discussion around that. So I'm going to leave it there. They were really beautiful moments, and it was really a lovely moment, a lovely way to end the year. And I was interested that audiences who were dance audiences, not friends of family, were coming to the festival. So I felt that not a lot, but maybe 20 people in the 2 days had heard about the festival and were interested in dance and had come for those reasons. So that for me was quite interesting, you know. I'd like to just also acknowledge that Sarah Lee has joined the room and that Catherine's connecting via audio. I'm going to end there. I know that we're kind of out of time. And of course, the recording will be made available, of course. And I know that the shifted time was not there, but I'm going to just also on my side to say thank you so much for the extraordinary community that you all are to us, and for helping provoke and push us. And I'm going to leave Yvette with the last words.
Which is totally inappropriate considering how late I came. But those are wonderful, wonderful pieces that you're drawing out, Leanne, and I just want to hear more and more, and we will talk more. Please, if you've got things you'd also like to share and talk about, let us know. A few people have emailed in the last day saying, oh, can we have this? Can we have that next year? So I think this is starting to percolate, and I think those conversations, I'm hoping next year will be, you know, beautiful and brilliant. I also had a session with students I've just left today on disability as an intercultural engagement, and it was a fantastic, it's partly why I couldn't get out. They were really, really interested in the intersectionality and talking about how does this sit alongside queer theory, feminist theory, other discussions around marginalities, and why are there different expectations and even terminologies around these different performances of identity, and the idea of performance in this. So I think that you know, it's rich, it's growing, these conversations, and, you know, this is the space we want to keep having it. Before we disappear, is everyone happy with the kind of times we've set? Is anyone wanting us to rethink anything? Because we've kind of decided and told you.
I maybe have a question. I thought I'm always confused if we're doing an hour and a half or an hour. I feel like today I thought it was an hour and a half, which is fine. But then the other day I thought it was an hour, and then I had to pop out and I missed a lot. So are we doing hours or hour and a half?
Yeah, we have to talk about this, but I think I also thought today was an hour and a half. I think there's enough for us to talk about for it to go on. But I think that's also for everyone to say. I think particularly now that we've moved towards having a reading and a speaker as a central thing, there is certainly time for us to do an hour and a half if people feel they can give us that time. Leanne, what do you think?
I mean, you know, I always think more time. I think an hour and a half is great if we can do it. I might have pushed this a bit speedily. I apologize for that if I've done it, because I know that Sydney had to go and I kind of didn't want us to lose anything. But you know, I think as we go, I know there's some people have offered to even do some prac sessions with us and stuff. So we're going to see if this is perhaps the space for that as well. But I feel that I can be on a Zoom for an hour and a half, not really more than that. So I'm fine with that if everyone else is.
Great. And then also to say, as Leanne was talking about festivals, and how this is growing and how incredibly important is the sharing, the debates, the development of audiences, that we are building toward doing a ADDN Jomba Access Festival in South Africa next year. When did we say we were doing that? In August, Leanne, somewhere around that, toward the end of August. So just to have that in your heads, that it might be in your planning of the year. If any of you want to join us, we'd love you to be there. But that planning is also happening as part of what we're doing in terms of these. And it will be workshops, performances, and also some roundtables. And we're hoping to bring together not only dance scholars but disability scholars as well. So I think it will be really interesting. I'm so excited. I keep waking up and going, you know. So if you've got ideas or thoughts, let us know about that as well. Yeah. So yes. Anything else?
Can I ask one more thing? Leanne, it is so hard for me, I know, to find articles from the newspapers in South Africa unless I go into my VPN and say I'm in South Africa, which I can do. But I didn't know if anyone had written anything about the festivals and you guys there that you could share with all of us.
I can. I mean, our journalists can be quite lazy in that they sometimes just reproduce the press release, but I can send you the URLs with no problem.
Okay.
There wasn't anyone who came and reviewed, unfortunately, and not for Body Moves either. But I'll send what I have. No problem.
Bummer. Sorry they didn't review. I feel like this is such a big issue in Chicago as well. And I don't know about for everyone else, but like there's actually a group of scholars and dancers that have decided that since no one is reviewing dance anymore, that it's called the Performance Response Journal, and it's also meant to, I see some people nodding. Yeah, okay. There was another of other reasons why they were also chose to do it. But I think it's interesting to think perhaps like in the future I'm not saying right away with ADDN, but if some of us are going to be going to things with others, that maybe like we think about knowing ahead of time that like that's something that we want to do.
It reminds me of a contribution from one of my thesis participants who said the main goal in his career was to get a bad review, because he had only ever had really, really patronizing people. And this was a guy who'd performed at the National Theatre and like been really, really successful. But he'd never actually got a negative review. And he said that some of the stuff that he'd been in was absolutely rubbish, and he knew that. But he wanted people to tell him that, because that showed that he was being treated like any other artist. Yeah.
I mean, I think this is a big contribution of Jomba, because they actually have the Kulomi and they have the graduate students that are assigned to write, and those reviews become such important resources. Again, they're archived, they're accessible. So I think Leanne has kind of created a model around that. And I think, but great idea, Sydney, that if we're going, that we undertake to even just do, I mean, it's partly what we're trying to do, verbal reports at these meetings. But I think having, if we take it upon ourselves to say we could review and share, it becomes a way of marking really important work that, unless it's somewhere, is lost because it is ephemeral. So I think the idea of where the network's place in reviewing is a brilliant question. I mean, it might even be space we can create on the website.
I was thinking maybe like a blog connected to the website that then becomes, and I'm not an expert at running those kind of things, but maybe, it would be a case of people could share on a blog.
That's brilliant. And I think we should definitely talk to our web mistress about how we could set that up. And I think that would be a fantastic resource, but also it will be a way of building archival material and awareness and criticality as well around the work that we're doing, and other people, and many people are doing. So and I think it also, it's that critical mass thing. So brilliant, Sydney. Thank you you come up with some really good things today. I don't know what you had for breakfast. I think it would be your time. But yeah,
traditional. No, I'm still in Finland, and I was a good Finnish person. I had traditional Finnish porridge for breakfast. So
you see,
Sarah Lee, you had your hand up.
Yeah, I want to apologize for being late. I got the time wrong. I thought it was 2 hours ahead, and can you believe it? As a South African, I got the time. I apologize. But what I was going to say, Sydney, that's a brilliant idea. And like Claire and Leanne have been doing amazing stuff with Kaluma. Medium is a good, medium.com is a good, if we can get that into the website, because they pick up, I've learned all these things over the last week around how Google works. But the pickup's quite high if we can get that kind of plug-in. And because I know that's also what Claire uses for Kaluma, and it's easy access, and it comes up often, and so as a way of kind of getting the word out there as well,
So it's medium,
as in I'm reading my ball.
Okay, medium. I have medium okay, good, better. Thank you. I've now got it.
Only the future, yeah.
Yeah, brilliant. That's fantastic. Any other suggestions, questions, challenges? Apart from we need an end of year party. We do. Is that it? Catherine, how are you? You're very quiet.
Fine, I got the time wrong as well.
My fault. I think I didn't send out the change early enough for everybody. I don't know if the email didn't go. I saw this morning. So maybe it's really my fault, because lots of emails have been coming up. But we will post the recording, because Sydney's reflections were really wonderful. So
yeah, no, I'd really like to hear that. And actually I'm actually going to Chicago in March, so it'd be great if you're around to connect or something. So that'd be really cool.
I'm gonna be in Finland.
It's always the case, we're never where we are.
Yeah. But if my community is still in Chicago, and I can tell you, I would love for you to meet like Maggie while you're there, or other disabled artists in our collective. So if you just email me, and I can make sure that you get hooked up to some people there.
That'd be great. Yeah, that'd be great. But and I dropped you an email to the network email this morning, just about someone that I've been in contact with who might have something that would be good to share at a meeting in the future next year. So yeah, all good.
Fantastic, fantastic. Thank you so much. It's great that people still have energy at this stage of the year. And we will collate and we will schedule, I think exciting that this network has taken off. We're really pleased. So yes, thank you very much. And Leanne, thank you also for your incredible work long, not just the network, but the years and years and years of work and inspiration. We thank you for
It's
that.
always a team effort, and thank you, Yvette, for the space for this. So yeah, have a beautiful festive season, everyone. I hope everyone gets to rest a little bit, and we'll see you in the new year.
Take care. Thank you.
Bye.